Earl H. Fry, Professor of Political Science and Endowed Professor of Canadian Studies at Brigham Young University, will hold the Fulbright Bicentennial Chair in American Studies in Finland during the 2011-2012 academic year. Professor Fry has directed BYU's Washington Seminar during the 2010-11 academic year. His acclaimed book, for which today's lecture will address, Lament for America, Decline of the Superpower, Plan for Renewal, was published in May 2010 by the University of Toronto Press. His current book project is entitled Renaissance America, a best practices blueprint for restoring U.S. prestige and competitiveness. Professor Fry is author or co-author of The United States of America in Foreign Relations and Federal Countries in 2009, The Long Road to Free Trade, Policy Options, 2007, The Urban Response to Internationalization, America the Vincible, U.S. Foreign Policy for the 21st Century, which is in its third edition. You've probably seen that text. It's a great text. North American Economic Integration, Policy Options with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the North American West in a Global Economy, published with the Pacific Council on International Policy. Professor Fry was recently selected for a 5-year term as a member of the Fulbright Senior Specialist Program. Previously, he served as a visiting lecturer at the Sorbonne, Director of International Education and Canadian Studies at SUNY Plattsburgh, a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, and as a Special Assistant in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR as it's known. During his period at USTR, he specialized in international investment issues and in U.S.-Canadian and U.S.-Japan relations. Today's lecture, as I mentioned, Lament for America versus Renaissance America. Can America compete effectively in a rapidly changing world? Please join me in welcoming Professor Earl Fry.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today at the Kennedy Center, which is near and dear to my heart. I wrote this book, Lament for America, and talking about many of the challenges that we face today. And the new book, Renaissance America, which is yet to be written, I'm going to be working on that when I'm in Finland, looking at best practices from around the world. Can they be adapted so that we can use them in the United States? And you might say, well, I mean, what got you into this notion that maybe the U.S. is not as competitive as it used to be? I hearken back. I grew up in California. Do we have any Californians here? All right. I grew up in the Bay Area. And when I was growing up, we had really high-quality public schools, and then I went to the University of California at Berkeley for 2 years before going on a mission. And things were really great in California. The infrastructure was the best in the world, and we used to have a saying that would go through the 1980s, as California goes today, the rest of the nation will go in a decade. Well, I hope not. Not now, because California has really fallen into a big hole. Its governance leaves a lot to be desired, whether it's been under Republican leadership or Democratic leadership. Public school system is in many areas very bad shape. And the University of California system, once considered the best public education system in the world, has been basically eroding because budgets have been cut rather dramatically. So here I come from a background in California where we look like that we were on the leading edge, and as time has gone on, we've seen some erosion. The second part of it was after my 2 years at Berkeley, I was called on a 2.5-year mission to France. And I got over it. I just loved being in France. But I said, well, this is really quaint. Here they take their 2-hour lunch, and they go home on their bicycles or their motorized bikes, and they'll never catch up with us. Well, over the decades, I've been going back. I taught at the Sorbonne for a year. A few years ago, Sister Fry and I directed the BYU program in Paris. And the thing that really stood out after about 40 years was they're doing some things better than we're doing them. For example, their healthcare system, they basically cover all of their people at half the per capita costs that we spend on healthcare. And even though they eat gobs of cheese and drink gallons of wine, they live longer than we do. Their infant mortality rate is far better than our own. So how did that happen? How did they get so much better in healthcare and spend so much less than we do? Or how about their urban transit system or their train system or their access to high-speed internet variety of areas where it looks like that they've really surpassed us. How has that happened? And so that's why I began to think about, well, where does the United States stand in the world today? Oftentimes we say, this is the best place in the world to live. USA, USA, we're number one. Well, what does that mean today? And that's what I want to discuss with you, and then discuss some of the solutions. So let's do this quickly so that I'll have time for your questions. Spent a lot of time in Washington. I think I've directed BYU's program back there for 10 semesters. And I would really recommend that you do that. If you when you get to junior or senior status, we've just come back from directing the program for 2 semesters, and the thing that really stands out in terms of the exit interviews with our students, this has been a momentous occasion in my life. There's absolutely nothing that we can do on campus, and we have a great campus and great classes that will replicate what the experience you will have back in the nation's capital, where you intern 4 days a week and then briefings on the 5th day. And a great facility back there in the heart of Washington, a few blocks from the White House at the gateway of Georgetown. It's a program that you should consider very seriously. It really changes lives. And whether it's that program or participating in study abroad programs, take one of your semesters and participate. And you will find how rewarding it will be. But I've done that for a lot, so here's an observer of what's going on in Washington. I've also been inside government, working in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative for a year under Ronald Reagan. And so we've seen it up close and personal. And we've had some problems. As you can see on the screen there, and I'm looking at the side here to look at my screen, but our fiscal budget for this year was not passed till April. And the fiscal year began last October 1. It took us over half of the year even to get a budget passed by the United States Congress and signed by the President. In a few weeks, we'll have this renewal of the debt ceiling. We have maybe until August 2nd. Because we already have hit the ceiling, we've actually exceeded the ceiling, and we've got to have a new authorization from Congress. And that's going back and forth on if that's going to be passed in time, or will we basically go into default for a period of time. This is a really, really important period. In addition, we're working on next year's fiscal budget, and we're not even close to getting it. It will begin on October 1 of this year. And we're not sure how that's going to come out, except probably we're going to spend somewhat less than we spent in the current fiscal year. Also, we have the 2012 elections coming up. It looks like the Democrats are going to be very vulnerable in the Senate because they have far more seats at stake than the Republicans do. In the House, the Republicans have a comfortable majority. They did lose in the special election in upstate New York, a very highly Republican district this past week, but we don't know if that will basically be a harbinger of 2012, and depending on how the economy goes, if the economy is still in the doldrums, the incumbent president, his position will be in jeopardy. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what happens next year in our elections. We now have divided government, and we have gridlock. We have the Republicans controlling the House, the Democrats controlling the Senate, and of course the White House. So that's divided government. In gridlock, in terms of we're not getting much passed. Not getting much passed right now. And the thing that really stands out and is somewhat discouraging is since 1961, when John F. Kennedy was president, since that time we've only balanced our federal budget 5 times in a half century, basically averaging 1 balanced budget every decade. And that is very discouraging. Why can't we do better than that? If we would go back a little bit more than a decade ago, to the end of 2000, President Clinton basically came out and announced saying, look, if things continue as they now are, the U.S. government will have no debt in a decade. Because during the Clinton years, we basically had 4 balanced budgets, in fact, a little bit in surplus. He said, if the economy continues to grow, if we have government spending restraint, that at the end of the decade, we will have no federal government debt. And the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget basically came out with statistics showing this makes sense. Well, we know we've gone in the opposite direction since that time. In fact, the day before the eventful 9/11, the U.S. government debt stood at $5.8 trillion. And today it stands at more than $14.3 trillion. So we've almost tripled our federal government debt in a period of that decade, when we thought maybe at the beginning of that decade that we would emerge with no government debt at all. We've gone in exactly the opposite direction. And in fact, after 9/11, we became very obsessed, of course, with getting those that caused 9/11. There were 19 terrorists involved, and of course, those that had put it together were Al-Qaeda. And we wanted to basically attack Al-Qaeda. And we began to go abroad in search of dragons to slay, as John Quincy Adams once said. And indeed, the damage caused on 9/11 was significant, almost 3,000 Americans killed, as well as citizens from over 50 other countries that day. But we also have, that event has caused trillions of dollars in damage to our economy as well. You know, and how we reacted to what happened on 9/11. In addition, you've got to look at the plight of the American household. Most people don't know this, but if you look at the beginning of the year 2000, the median real household income was actually higher than at the end of 2009 when we factor in inflation. So we went through, for a lot of Americans, we went through a lost decade. A lost decade, and many are still grappling to get on their feet because most of their wealth was tied into their equity in their homes, to their pensions, and of course to their jobs. And when we went through the Great Recession of a couple of years ago, things really turned south very quickly. You know, a lot of people lost a lot of the equity in their homes. If you're in Las Vegas today and you have a mortgage, 70% of the inhabitants of Las Vegas are underwater. What they owe on their mortgages is worth more than the homes could sell for today. And they've taken the hit. They took a hit in terms of their pensions because a lot of the pensions were linked to the stock market. And a lot of them became concerned about the jobs that they had and the jobs of their family members. So this was a lost decade for many Americans. We have to keep that in mind. In addition, we've had a concentration of wealth like we haven't seen since at least the end of the 1920s. Notice what we have down there. 1% of American households now control almost 36% of all the private wealth in the United States. We haven't had this for decades. That 1% controls more wealth than the bottom 90% of all American households. And so even though we've had growth in our economy, if you look at wealth accumulation, if you look at income on a yearly basis where that 1% takes in about 24% of all the income, you can see a lot of it has been concentrated in relatively few hands. And it's not getting better, it's getting worse. Okay, that concentration is getting worse. And you wonder, well, what will be the repercussions of that down the line? And we can discuss that after a while. But it is sort of a new Gilded Age in many respects. Budgets, deficits, and debt. Remember, deficits occur on a yearly basis. The debt is the accumulation of the deficits. And this gives you an idea how big our economy is, how big our nation is, but also how big government is. Look at those figures there. In the 2012 budget request by President Obama, what he is requesting is larger than the GDP of Germany. So this is just government spending. It's larger than everything that Germany produced last year. And Germany ranks as the world's fourth largest economy. Notice as well that our deficit in fiscal year 2010 was larger than the GDP of Spain, which ranked as the 9th largest economy in the world. And combined state and local government spending, remember we have a federal system, so it's not just federal spending, but also state spending, local government spending. Combined state and local government spending in 2010 was actually larger than the GDP of France, which has the world's 5th largest economy. And when you add federal, state, and local spending together, it's actually larger than the GDP of China, which is the 2nd largest economy in the world. So this gives you an idea of, well, how large our economy is, but also how much we spend in comparison to the rest of the world. Total U.S. federal government debt now has surpassed $14.3 trillion. Our GDP last year was $14.7 trillion. We believe this year that gross federal government debt will basically surpass 100% of GDP. And we have only had this happen 3 years in our history, 1945, 1946, and 1947, where it's been larger. And of course, that was linked to World War II and coming out of World War II and trying to get everyone back to work and moving towards a much more civilian-based economy. But only 3 years in the entire history of the United States has our gross federal debt been worse than it will be at the end of this fiscal year. And look at what happened back then versus what we now face. In 45, 46, 47, we could look at the end of war in 1945, which was our worst war in history in terms of the loss of American lives other than the Civil War. So we would be coming out of a very devastating war. But we're getting everyone home, getting our young people into schools, getting them back into the workforce. What do you guys now face? Well, you face this huge government debt that's going to have to be paid off someday. And it's going to grow. We think it's going to grow by $1 trillion or more each year over the next few years. And somewhere along the line, someone has to pay for that. The second thing that you, as young Americans, face is that we are now at the point where our baby boom generation, my generation, is beginning to retire with full benefits, Social Security and Medicare. And there's 76 million of us. That's over a quarter of the American population. And so they're now beginning to retire, and where we now have about a little bit more than 3 workers per retiree, by 2030 we're going to go down to about a little bit more than 2 workers per retiree. So what does that mean? You've got to cope with the growing debt of the government. You also have to cope with the entitlement benefits that are going to be going to a huge percentage of our population. And we've got to solve these problems, and we have to solve these problems very quickly. I put down the Kingdom of Washington, D.C. I wrote an editorial for the Deseret News not long ago. I did a series of editorials when I was in Washington. I called it the Kingdom. But it's very interesting. We have over 3,000 counties in the United States of America, and 6 of the 10 most prosperous counties and 9 of the 14 most prosperous counties, measured by median household income, are in the Washington, D.C. area. They're basically counties in Maryland and Virginia surrounding Washington, D.C. So out of more than 3,000 counties, we've got 9 of the most prosperous 15 in just one geographical area. And I don't think that's by accident. I don't think that's by accident. It's because the government spending has become so large. That pie has become so much larger that there are many people that basically feed from that trough. And it's not so much the government employees, but it's also the notion of pay to play. And what I mean by that is if you want to get something done, you better have a lobbyist back in Washington. We now have almost a record number of lobbyists, and their compensation is at record levels, which means it must be a growing industry. And so what you see is a fair number of people that make their livings dealing with the government. It can be government contractors, it can be lawyers, it can be lobbyists, it can be accountants. But there we see a huge concentration of the most prosperous counties in the entire country. 9 of the top 15 are right around the Washington, D.C. area. And the faculty apartment back in Washington is out in McLean, Virginia. And if you take a little trip from McLean out to Great Falls National Park, which is only about 6 miles away, you go along roads where you've got lots of McMansions. All right, and you can see the same in parts of Maryland and other parts of Virginia. These are basically what's my definition of a McMansion, probably a home with over 6,000 square feet and with all the trappings that go along with that. There are some people doing extremely well. extremely well. And as I said, not necessarily government employees, but those that basically represent companies or bid for contracts or whatever. And in some ways, what goes on within the Beltway, which is the area around 95 and 495 that encompasses Washington, D.C., it is far different from what is going on in most other parts of the United States. And we have sort of a divide there. Does the Beltway understand what's going on elsewhere in the country? Do we understand what's going on in the Beltway? Now, I argue in the book that we are superpower in relative decline. Okay, that's sort of a mouthful right there. And why? Well, we have the rise of these competitor nations, like the EU or China. Some indications are that even before 2020, using what we call a purchasing power parity index that factors out the basically currency values, that China may actually surpass us even before we get to the end of this decade as the world's largest economy. So we do have the rise of competitor nations. Look at China and India, which once were peripheral players economically, globally. Now, and they represent 36% of the world's population. They are now becoming significant players, as are other what we call emerging markets. So that's one reason why we might be becoming, less prominent as a superpower. The second would be, as you see down there, it's a little difficult to read, but it's a combination basically globalization, unprecedented technology change, and what I call creative destruction. And I'll give you some examples there if you look on the screen. And particularly if you look in terms of job creation and loss, this is part of creative destruction. It may be that the nominal figures will say this year we actually created 2 million net new jobs, or we lost 2 million net new jobs. But behind the scenes you see that there's a whole lot of people either losing jobs or gaining new jobs. There's a churning in our workforce like we've never seen before. And that's sort of a manifestation of this combination of globalization, unprecedented technology change, and creative destruction. And the third part of it is what I consider fault lines that we're not dealing with, and that's what I basically talk about in the book. A little bit more about that, not much, but the world is becoming more globalized. It's not flat like Tom Friedman says, but it's becoming more globalized. It's becoming more interdependent, and we have to deal with that. And as you can see, when you look at the technology change in that, we may be doubling our information base every year now, or even less than that. Well, how will we keep up? Are we doing as well as other nations in terms of adapting to this change? It's sad that if you're in engineering, that probably a quarter of what you learn as a freshman is no longer applicable when you graduate. We're into a period where all this new information is coming in, and things that we once learned are no longer applicable. And we have to adapt to that in order to remain competitive. And I think that the change, I give you the example of Argentina on the board there, where it used to be one of the most prosperous nations and then fell into the way down to the 80s. I think change today, either rising or falling, will be more rapid than ever before in human history. So as you go through, let's say, to mid-century, you're going to be on a roller coaster ride like we've never seen before. And some of it's going to be fantastic in terms of new discoveries. Some of it's going to be very, very traumatic, because we're into an era of change like we've never seen before in terms of the rapidity of change in human history. These are the domestic fault lines that I cover in the book. You can look at them, and if something really stands out as we get to Q&A, then let's focus on it. But these are the 15 fault lines I basically tried to concentrate on in the book, talk about why they're fault lines, and also give some solutions. And in addition, this sort of gives you this growing interdependency, interconnectedness, in a variety of areas. Many of the products that we make in the United States today, we could not make without having component parts come from other countries. Some people say, wouldn't it be nice to go back to Fortress America? I don't think Fortress America ever existed. And it certainly couldn't exist today because we are interdependent with the rest of the world. Whether it be parts for an airplane or particularly for computers, we are just so dependent on supply chains that go around the world. And in all of these dimensions that you see on the screen, we are being impacted more and more at the neighborhood level by events which transpire or actions which are taken outside the boundaries of the United States of America. I think we're going to see more of that as time goes on. What about the U.S. at mid-century? Well, we're going to continue to grow our population, unlike most of the West, or much of the West, where there's going to be a declining population. We're going to continue to grow. And we may even be about 440 million by mid-century, maybe a little bit less than that. It depends on immigration levels. But notice as well that almost all of this growth will come from immigration. Over 80% of that growth will come from immigration. Immigrants, as they arrive between now and 2050, their children and their grandchildren. So a lot of what is going to transpire in terms of population growth will be derived from immigration. In addition, by 2042, perhaps we will become a majority-minority country. No longer will we talk about a white majority. And that's not necessarily so bad, but we've got to guarantee that everyone, no matter what their ethnicity, will have a good opportunity at a first-rate education and a good opportunity to enter the private sector and to excel. That's something that we're going to have to work on more than perhaps ever before because of the changes demographically that we are going to be facing in our society. In addition, notice that we'll become even more urbanized. We're still mostly urbanized today. We'll become more urbanized, but probably with more self-contained suburbs, where you'll basically live in the suburb, but you'll also work in your suburb instead of commuting into the downtown core. We'll remain a military superpower. I don't think there's much doubt about that, but in a lot of other dimensions, we will not be as strong as we are today. And what will be the quality of life of the average American at mid-century? That's something that we have to ponder. In addition, how steep will be our relative decline? Because you might say, well, Fry, why do you think we're in decline? Give me an indication why we're in decline. Well, look at our GDP as a percentage of global GDP. Look at manufacturing, where we led the world for a century in manufacturing. Now, we've now been surpassed by China. It's our percentage of global manufacturing is going down. Our percentage of direct investment in terms of global investment going down. Our percentage of exports, for decades we led the world in exports. We're now number 3. We're behind China and Germany in exports. And the outcomes of K through 12 education is very clear that we're falling behind. So these are very concrete indicators of where we are not as highly ranked as we used to be. And how will that carry us through till mid-century? Well, now let's talk about the good things. And this is Renaissance America. We put that up. We didn't really mean to put a McMansion up there, okay? This is sort of going back to the Renaissance period. Can we overcome these problems? And my notion is we can. After all, the problems we face today are not nearly as severe as we faced during the Great Depression, or nearly as severe as we faced during World War II. So let's keep these things in perspective. We've dug a deep hole, but we can dig ourselves out of that hole if we're smart. Our strengths, this gives you a laundry list. We're still the world's largest economy, and I just go down, and we're the largest trading nation, but of course that includes imports. Still the largest foreign direct investor, where you gain control of a company overseas through a direct investment. And this, again, is sort of a laundry list of some of our strengths. We're still a very large nation territorially, the 4th largest in the world, so we're very expansive. We have the 3rd most populated nation in the world. Big gap between 1 and 2, but we're still number 3, and we'll continue to grow population-wise. And we lead the world still in technological innovation. So these are really positive points that we have going for us. In addition, we have been the world's leader in job creation, particularly among the Western countries. We've fallen back a little bit, but there's no reason why we can't regain that momentum. And you see the others in terms of affluency. What do I mean by that? What does the average worker make? Take that average paycheck, what can that worker buy in terms of a basket of goods and services? We're still right up at the top of the major Western nations. We're very dynamic, we're very diversified. You know, you don't have to live in New York or Los Angeles to get ahead. You can be anywhere. Our lowest unemployment rates are in mid-America. They're in mid-America. You know, they're not in California, they're not in New York. And a lot of these mid-America economies are doing fairly well. You know, so we're very diversified in terms of our economic base. We are one of 4 leading nations in terms of natural resources and energy, along with Canada and Russia and Brazil. You know, we're still ranked in the top 5 nations in the world in terms of oil production. It's just that we use so much oil that we have to import a great deal of oil. So we're blessed, a veritable cornucopia of natural resources and energy sources. And we're very stable politically, we're very stable economically, and above all, through history, we've tended to be resilient. We adapt. If we go in the wrong direction, we understand that, and eventually we turn around and head in the right direction. And that's what's going to serve us well in the future. You know, that adaptation and that resiliency, something that can serve us so well in the future. This gives you a map of the United States, and I've been doing this for a long time now. And basically, instead of putting the name of the state in, I put a country that basically is producing about the same in terms of goods and services. So you notice on the map, Utah is Ukraine. Utah has fewer than 3 million people. We produce about the same as Ukraine does with over 40 million people. You know, there's a lot of dynamism still in our economy, a lot of dynamism. And we have one state economy that ranks among the top 10 of the nation states in the world. That's California. We have roughly 15 that rank in the top 25 and something like 35 or so that rank in the top 50 national economies in the world out of 200 to about 200 nation states or territories. So you can see there's still a lot of dynamism there in terms of what we're doing economically. If we just get our act together and start to move forward again. So what do? We need to solve the 15 fault lines. I'm going to try to do that in this new book. And in order to do that, I'm going to go abroad for a year. You know, we're going to live in Helsinki, Finland. And we're going to look at best practices in Europe. We're going to look at best practices in Asia and the emerging markets. What can we learn from that? What about Finland? It has less than twice the population of Utah. They have one of the 3 top-ranking K through 12 education systems in the world. They're very good in terms of their infrastructure. They have a high quality of life. You know, very good urban infrastructure and transportation. What can we learn from little Finland? What can we learn from France? What can we learn from Germany? What can we learn from Singapore? What can we learn from Brazil? And that's what I'm going to do, and not just looking in the public sector, but the private sector. You know, why are we an outlier in healthcare? Why do we spend 17% of GDP on healthcare and leave 50 million Americans without any insurance at all, when everyone else in the West covers all of their legal residents and does it at half the cost on a per capita basis of the United States of America? Obviously, we've got to do something about that. It's a glaring problem. Well, what can we learn from others? Some of them may not be relevant, but in many cases, maybe they will. It means that we're going to have to be humble enough to recognize we can learn lessons from others, just like they have learned lessons from us through the decades. We can now begin to learn lessons from others and hopefully adapt them to our particular cultural setting and begin to move forward again to improve our competitiveness. So, concluding observations. Much of what will happen to the United States as a superpower will depend on the American people themselves. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. Because all the other nations I've mentioned, or groups of nations, they have their own fault lines as well. They have their own challenges that they're going to face. We're not sure if the Eurozone is going to stay together. We're not sure about that. You know, that's a big problem facing Europe. China, can it continue to move forward with a basically authoritarian regime? Can it basically bring in all those people to the West, particularly in the countryside, that will be looking for jobs? You know, lots of challenges there in a China or in India or Brazil or wherever it might be. So a lot of how we're going to do will depend on the American people themselves, what they're willing to basically accept in terms of changing policies. We can't succumb to the Linus Van Pelt syndrome. And many of you have no idea who Linus Van Pelt is, but he's sort of the beloved character from the Peanuts comic strip. And he once said these immortal words: "There's no problem so big that you can't try to run away from it." And we within the Beltway, and we as Americans in general, have been trying to run away from big problems. And it's come time to basically say we're going to face these problems, and we're going to solve these problems. I think that the plan for renewal can work, but it's going to involve a lot of self-sacrifice and a lot of short-term pain in order to get long-term gain. And of course, politicians today say, if you're talking about short-term pain, it means I'm going to lose the next election, because Americans generally don't like short-term pain. But somewhere along the line, we're going to have to adapt. Indeed, politician is a fine word, but what we really need are more statesmen and stateswomen in Washington. We need problem solvers. We need people that will come together across party lines and basically say, this is a problem, let's sit down together as Americans first and solve these problems. Let's not worry about, how well we'll do as Republicans or Democrats, or what we'll gain because the Ryan plan on Medicare seems to, be turning off some older people, or that the president's plan on health care seems to be turning off some conservative people. Let's get together as Americans and solve the fault lines. And we're still not at that mindset yet. We've got to get to that mindset. The world in 2050, I think, is going to be different, and there's going to be a whole lot more multilateralism in the world. Where we're going to have to work together across national boundaries to solve problems that cannot be solved unilaterally by any one nation. We've given it a try as the world's leading superpower. We've given it a try, but over time, we're going to have to work with other nations. It's going to be messier, because if you can do things unilaterally, generally you get results more quickly and more decisively. But probably we're at the point where it's going to have to be more multilateral. We can't continue to spend on the military almost half of what the world is currently spending on the military. If your economic pie is becoming a little bit smaller, then you're going to have to look at areas to cut back. And the military, even though, as I said, we're going to continue to be a military superpower because we're light years ahead of the rest of the world, particularly in terms of air and naval power, we're going to have to look at some cutbacks there. And that means that we're going to have to work with other nations. I was at a meeting with Secretary Clinton back in the fall, and she's just saying, we're going to move in this direction, and we're going to have a more vigorous diplomacy and working with our allies to solve problems, but that's easier said than done. But we're probably going to have to move in that direction. We still have, in terms of looking at the State Department actually has fewer foreign service officers than there are people playing in military bands in our armed services. And we're going to have to look at how we recalibrate that budget in terms of diplomacy versus military. And it's interesting that General Petraeus and Secretary of Defense Gates have both said that there's too much military in U.S. foreign policy. They both have used that term bluntly. And we're going to have to find a balance. We're going to have to find a balance. And we look at what we're now doing overseas. You've got to remember that 1 out of 100 Americans is doing 100% of the fighting for the United States. Do you know anyone that's even involved in the conflicts in Iraq or Afghanistan? 1 out of America, 1 out of 100. Then they're just going back and back, come home to their family for a few months, and then they go back into the field. And we feel it personally because we have a son who's a Marine sergeant, who's a sniper, who's done 2 tours of duty in Iraq, and now is in Afghanistan. He's in a dangerous area. And Afghanistan is the longest war in American history. And we believe that this year we'll have more fatalities than ever before in Afghanistan. There were 7 Americans killed yesterday in Afghanistan. Did you know that? And we're going to have to look at how we can do in terms of projecting power, perhaps doing it in a different way than having boots on the ground, perhaps relying more on intelligence, relying more on special forces, relying more on rapid deployment, relying more on using predators. Messy, but probably we're going to have to move in that direction, because Iraq was basically a unilateral war. It was called the Coalition of the Willing, but we paid over 90% of the bills and took over 90% of the fatalities. And now Afghanistan is emerging that way too, where we now have 2/3 of the troops, and a lot of the other troops from other countries, they're leaving. The Canadians are going to leave. Some of our staunchest allies are leaving. And we're going to have to look at ways of how can we try to bring about the type of world we want, but still control our costs, control the use of our armed services. And it's going to be difficult to do that. It's going to be very difficult, but we're probably heading in that direction. And lastly, you know, like I said, it's going to be unprecedented. We're going to need unprecedented cooperation. I think there's going to be some great things happen. Quality of life for a lot of people are going to improve because of what we're going to discover in medicine and other areas. We're into the age of individual empowerment, that through cyberspace you can be in a village in India and still become a global player if you're bright, intelligent, entrepreneurial. This is going to be fantastic. But also, as I said, change is going to be very rapid, both for good and not so good. And you've got to adapt to that. You've got to get a good education. You've got to be involved in lifetime learning. You've got to be involved in the political process. This is your nation. That's one thing when we go back to Washington, the thing that we really instill in the students, you've got to be active participants in the future. We already have one of our graduates who's a member of Congress. But you need to be engaged, whether it's nationally or the state level or the local level. Be concerned about civics. Know about civics. Know about our history. Know about policy alternatives. And above all, cling to that iron rod, because through all this change that may be occurring, if you are true and faithful in the gospel and cling to that iron rod, you will get through a lot of difficulties and still feel good about yourself and your loved ones and the things that are important in this lifetime. Okay, with that, let me stop and let's take a few minutes. We'll try to, how about 5 minutes to the hour? We'll get out of here, okay? I know you need to get to other classes. So let's take a few questions that you might have. So here's, see Lament for America talking about the taskmaster. We've got to do better. Renaissance America, that book will be, this is how we do better. We're going to give some really specific guidelines, best practices on how we can do better, and then building on that foundation, which is still very strong, and that we can move forward. So hopefully I'm leaving you with some optimism and not just with, the notion of the fault lines. Okay, questions that you might have. Yes?
Hold on. Just turn the power on. Yeah, on the mic.
That working? Okay, great.
I really liked your lecture a lot. My question is, you talk about this relative decline of the U.S., and I'm wondering if that is such a bad thing. I mean, just because other countries are improving and maybe we're getting worse relative to them doesn't mean that we're getting worse as a nation. So is relative decline really something that we need to worry about, or is it okay as long as the world as a whole is improving?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think modest relative decline is not necessarily a problem, because I'm arguing that we're coming from a base in 1945 where we were the most powerful superpower in human history, at least in terms of our global reach. Because in 1945, we account for half of what the entire world is producing. We are by far and away the strongest military power, and we have a monopoly on atomic weapons. So truly a very, very powerful nation then. And then we go through the spurts of, we go through the Cold War, and then by the time we get into the 1990s, there's only one superpower left. The Soviet Union has disintegrated. And then, by the year 2000, things are looking pretty good for us. We've gone through a tremendous decade of the 90s where trillions of dollars of household wealth was created, and things are looking really, really good for us. And then we go through, as I said, pretty much a lost decade of the first decade of the 21st century. So, I agree with you. We can have some relative decline as long as that, let's say, that global economic pie is growing. So our portion of that economic pie is not as big, but that does not mean that our quality of life and standard of living in the United States has to decline. So the big question will be, how steep will be that relative decline? Can we overcome the fault lines? And if we can do that, then I don't think it will be that much of a problem for us. But if it's more precipitous, and remember what I said, as we put those three indicators together, globalization, unprecedented technology, change, and creative destruction, where you can go up quickly and you come down quickly. We don't want to be Great Britain, in 1920 or 1945 even. Once the greatest nation on earth for centuries, all of a sudden the sun is setting on the British Empire and the decline is rather precipitous. So that's what we have to guard against. So it's really the nature of how steep the decline will be. But if we can make it relatively small, and that economic pie is growing globally, and all these innovations are helping to improve our quality of life, then we'll still be in good shape. Other questions?
I have a question. You began your lecture by talking about France, and you referenced other countries like Finland that have more extensive public transportation and K through 12, better K through 12 education and healthcare. And obviously these countries spend a lot through their governments on those programs. But my question is, why is it that in the United States it seems like we spend so much, we have such a huge debt, but we get so little comparatively? Is that just due to the military, or what are other factors in that?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Why have we built up all this debt during the first decade of the 21st century, but we haven't improved our infrastructure very much? You can go into debt if you're doing it for long-term investment reasons, to basically build up the most modern infrastructure in the world. We haven't done that. And that's part of the problem, where we've been wasting a lot of money. Now, the military, as I said, we're probably going to have to have some cutbacks. And let me clarify, after 9/11, we needed to go into Afghanistan. We needed to get al-Qaeda. And the Taliban government at the time was sheltering al-Qaeda, so we had to do something. But as time went on, and where the CIA was basically saying, well, we think that there are fewer than 100 or at most 200 al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan, then what we began to do was nation building. And we don't do very well in nation building, nor do other nations. And Afghanistan is sort of a graveyard of nation building efforts. And so we got turned around, and instead of getting al-Qaeda, of course, then we diverted our attention to Iraq. And as far as we know, Saddam Hussein didn't have anything to do with al-Qaeda. He was a secularist. They didn't like him very much. Didn't have the weapons of mass destruction. And so we diverted, and then finally we get Osama. And well, what can we learn from that? And can we be smarter in terms of trying to project our power? So yeah, that's one area where we spent a lot of money. We basically have added, we've almost doubled our defense budget through the past decade, a little bit less, but almost a doubling. And we've almost doubled our intelligence budget during that decade as well. We're going to have to go back and look and say, well, can we now perhaps have some cutbacks? We created the most how should I put it, humongous bureaucracy almost in our history with the Department of Homeland Security, which for me was a colossal mistake, because there you just added layers and layers of bureaucracy, bringing the Coast Guard in with FEMA, and it's very difficult to get a very good decision out of it. So these are things we've got to say, maybe we overdone it after 9/11. Okay, now can we come back and sort of learn lessons and begin to cut back in areas? But we've got to look at entitlements. We've got to look at our tax code, which since the time of Ronald Reagan in 1986, a bipartisan effort where we cleaned up that tax code, we've added tens of thousands of pages to the tax code with the explanations of it. And a lot of them have special favors. And we've got to basically find a modern-day Hercules who will go in with a big hose and clean out the Aegean stables, because it is a mess. So there are lots of areas that we have to clean up. It's not just defense, where we're going to have some cutbacks, intelligence, some cutbacks, but entitlements, we've got to take on entitlements. There are a variety of areas that we're going to have to look at. It's going to have to take some very brave politicians, and some of them will probably lose in the next election, but somewhere along the line we've got to stick it out, and by doing that, then we can get back on course and begin to spend more on infrastructure modernization, which we need to, and other things, our school systems, better teachers, pay them more, but expect more from them, make sure that they're from the top half of the graduating classes in college. They're not now, normally. And so there's a lot of things that we need to do in order to not only clean up our debt mess, but to basically begin to have smarter policies. And maybe one last question.
With the elections coming up in a way, what do you think the biggest issue should be for us for the Renaissance of America?
Oh, it's basically facing up, we as Americans, to the fact that we've dug at this hole in so many areas, and are we willing to basically take on the pain? Because we're not going to tackle all this and not raise taxes. Can't be a Grover Norquist here, say no more taxes. You can have cutbacks in budget, but you're going to have some more taxes. You're going to have to be intelligent about this. You're going to have to tackle entitlements. That's Social Security. I could solve Social Security without many problems, but Medicare and Medicaid, they're more intractable because they're linked to the fact that our health care spending. You know, the past 9 years we doubled health care spending if you're covered by a provider. 9 years, we doubled health care spending. And whereas the rate of inflation overall has been much less than that. So this is where we've got to begin tackling. And so if you're looking at 2012, we've got to look at how can we try to balance a budget over time, but without stifling our economic recovery, because if we're going to do this over time, we need more jobs and we need economic growth. Well above 3% a year. We need to get into the 4% range. The last quarter was 1.8%. That's not going to do it for us. And so we need to cut back on government spending, but at the same time, not stifle the private sector. We need to look at where there's over-regulation. We need to cut back on corporate taxes. They're too high. But in order to do that, you've got to cut out all the favors that are there. Did you know that a couple of years ago I'll finish with this, among hedge fund managers, there were several that made $1 billion each per year, and they were able to pay taxes at 15% rate. And Congress said, we're going to change that, but they never changed that. They were paying less as a percentage of taxes than their chauffeurs were. We got, again, these are easy things. It seems like these are sticking out like a sore thumb. And these are things that going up to 2012 we have to look at. My fear is that we're going to continue to have gridlock and divided government and not come together to solve the problems. And we're just, it's going to go longer, and the longer it takes, the more of a crisis it becomes. We can't afford that. Anyway, but we can do it. That's the main thing I want to let we can solve these problems, but it's not going to be wishful thinking. It's going to take tangible actions, and we're all going to have to be engaged in shared sacrifice and really enlightened thinking. But if we're willing to do that, by the end of this decade, it will not be a lost decade. We will be moving forward again, and we will still talk about the U.S. as a superpower, and a superpower which is very actively engaged and positively engaged in what is going around us in the world. Thank you very much.